Hello and welcome to this edition of IIEA Insights with me, Dan O'Brien. Today, rather than have a guest, at the halfway point of the year, I thought it might be useful to do an economic outlook of where we are at the moment. A lot of gloom, a lot of uncertainty around at the moment. So I thought I'd start off by a sort of an international context, looking at what might be described as the good, the bad, and the ugly before looking at some of the main economic indicators for the Irish economy and discussing some of those. I've got about 30 slides. I'll go through them over the next 30 minutes or so. Good. So let's get going with the good in these times where so much emphasis is put on the bad and the ugly. Lots of positives, in my view, around. One is resilience. I'll come back to that in a few slides. But one area of resilience that's been really important from an Irish perspective in particular has been globalization. We're an incredibly globalized economy, and the much talked about deglobalization process is not really showing up in the data. There's a real risk of that, of course, and it does look like the US-China economic relationship is decoupling, and investment between Europe and China is also not anyway what it was 10 years ago for very good reason. So there is some areas where the world is deglobalizing, but overall, it's hard to find that in the trade or data, the data on data flows. But probably the best one is foreign direct investment. If we look at total stocks of foreign direct investment globally, the latest figures aren't out for 2024, but 2023 was the highest on record, and the trend is still rising. So that is all the value of all of the foreign subsidiaries around the world. A positive development for Ireland. Things may slow, of course, but as we discussed in Insights a couple of weeks ago with four panelists, there's a general sense that even with the uncertainty in the United States, that companies will maintain their globalized practices, and that is something that is simply too important for them, and it would take something very, very big, even bigger than the current administration, to roll that back. Technological advances are happening all the time, and we do discuss them, but they tend not to make the front pages. Although AI is different, it does make the front pages, and for good reason. It has the possibility to be the next electricity, to really transform the economy, to transform productivity. The story I often tell when I started paying attention to AI was when a friend who owns a company laid off 3 out of the 4 of his marketing department once he was able to use AI, and that has worked successfully for him. Those people were not unemployed. They went on to get other employment, and I think that's one of the things we need to be slightly careful about. There is talk of a sort of jobs apocalypse because of technology. There will certainly be some disruption, but as we're going to discuss now, there's certainly little sign so far of any kind of major disruption to employment. Indeed, employment continues to grow strongly. So this is just one example of where we underestimate the implication, the effects of technological change in renewable energy. Predictions have constantly got it wrong about how much renewable energy is being installed. As I said, the technological change is really continues to drive, always has, continues to drive economic development and prosperity. We speak a lot in Europe about what we're getting wrong, and that's absolutely right. We have serious problems in Europe, but it is remarkable how little we talk about the successes. And one of the big successes of Europe over the past decade has been the labour market. By nearly every indicator in most European countries, labour markets have performed really, really well. The most basic indicator, of course, that we look at, and the most commonly looked at, is unemployment. And we see that over more than a decade, unemployment has been falling in the European Union and the Eurozone. We're now at one of the lowest rates in decades, and that is in the case in nearly every country. The trend is either low and stable or continuing downwards. In most countries, some small increases in countries like Germany that have had a problem recently with their, particularly in industry, but generally speaking, labour market has performed really well. Employment is at record levels. There have never been more Europeans employed. And also important to say, as we compare ourselves a lot with the United States, that the share of adults working in Europe is now up at around 75% and has converged with the United States. We used to be, for many decades, well behind the United States in terms of the share of our adults at work, but in the EU now, we actually converged with the United States, and employment growth in Europe has actually been stronger than the United States over the past half decade or so, despite GDP growth being considerably lower. One of the most interesting new pieces of information I've come upon recently is in relation to the number of ICT specialists employed in Europe. Eurostat recently published this figure in terms of growth of people specialized in ICT. We see a two-thirds increase over the past decade. That, in numbers terms, brings European ICT people at work from 6 to 10 million. A very big number, a number that surprised me. That is not just people in support services, but more than half of those people are employed in tech companies. About 40% of them are employed in other areas as tech support, tech specialists. But a very positive picture there in terms of employment. And ICT specialists now make up 5% of employment in the European Union, 1 in 20 jobs, and the trajectory is clearly upward. So another sign that we have certainly a problem in scaling up our tech companies and other companies, but it's not as though everyone is heading off to find venture capitalists in California. We need more of that, of course, here in Europe, and have our own companies and scale up. The very big tech companies would be good, and it needs to happen, and hopefully will happen. But we certainly are doing well on the employment front in Europe. Resilience, coming back to that point, the 2020s, in the 1920s were known as the Roaring Twenties. I think we could call the 20s in this century the resilient 20s. We started off within months of the new decade with pandemic and lockdowns. We had an energy shock. It's often forgotten now that energy prices, gas prices, peaked in Europe well before the invasion of Ukraine in August 2021 and came down afterwards, but they were up to 10 times higher than they had been previously. Huge energy shock for Europe. Then, of course, we had the invasion itself, the first full-scale war in Europe, and the threat of war. We'll come back to that in a little while. For consumer prices peaked at around 10% in most Western countries. That was true also in Ireland. By mid-2022, we were just shy of 10% before inflation started to fall back. A really big shock, particularly for younger people who never remembered having inflation at anything above sort of levels where you might even notice it. And then interest rates in response to that left the floor, went up to 4.5%, one of the most rapid monetary tightenings in history in the 14 months between June 2022 and September 23, where they stabilized for almost a year and are now coming down. Also, you have tariff uncertainties since the election in the US last November, peaked possibly, hopefully, on what was called Liberation Day on April 2nd, but still massive uncertainty. Yet, despite all of that, we have those sort of positive labor market developments, low unemployment. We've avoided recession, which, if somebody had told me on New Year's Eve at the beginning of the decade that we would have all of these shocks and we wouldn't be in a deep depression, I would have been quite surprised. So certainly great resilience in the European economy and also in the Irish economy, which has continued to boom despite all of these things. So let's just look at, and finally, it's always worth saying that geopolitical risks, about which we talk a lot these days, and rightly so, can often be exaggerated. You go back to 9/11, and the US economy actually came out of recession in that quarter. I was commissioned to write a report for Forfas back at the time of the Iraq War to look at how it might impact the Irish economy. And when you look now, or in retrospect after that war, really the only negative impact was fewer US tourists. There wasn't really an impact from that, despite it being a huge geopolitical event at the time. But the impact for economies further afield was almost non-existent. And if we look at the Middle East since October 7th, there's been a lot of talk about, less so now, but there was in the year afterwards a lot of talk about a broader regional war. Yet oil prices have been lower in the aftermath of that since that outbreak in October of 2023, and it hasn't caused oil prices to rise. In fact, as I observed, they've actually been lower since then. But there's plenty of bad stuff. So in terms of bad, let me just focus on US tariffs as an immediate concern. I think it's important to recognize just how different this time is compared to the last time. There's already a 10% tariff on most goods from Europe into the United States. We've been fortunate in Ireland in that pharmaceuticals haven't been hit yet, which are by far our biggest export to the United States. But other areas like aluminium have been hit with even higher tariffs. So it has been absolutely transformative. We don't know where that will settle as of yet, but if we just go back and have a look at weighted tariffs during the first Trump administration, we'll see that really, if we look at Europe and we look at other countries, there was very little change. The only country that really had a change in terms of tariff was China, where tariffs went from being low single digits to over 10%. And of course, they've gone an awful lot higher since that. But just in terms of around here for Europe, really, there was almost no impact on if we look at all of the European goods going into the United States, the tariff remained below 2%. This time, as I say, it's radically different, and where that ends, we don't know. So major uncertainty around that. Is that really important? There are many, many metrics to show how Ireland is more vulnerable than most other countries. If you look at per capita goods exports to the United States, Ireland exports more than Canada or Mexico, the two most closest neighbors. We can also look at it, exports and imports as a share of GDP, charted here, which shows again Ireland's exceptional integration into the US economy. So plenty still to worry about there. Even though it may be not quite as alarming as it was on April 2nd, given the level of pushback from various quarters towards the extreme trade policy of the current US administration. What about the ugly? Security and defence. We had a very good session at the Institute yesterday on the European Defence, the European Commission Defence White Paper. Anyone with an interest in security and defence, particularly European security and defence, might want to go back and have a look at that session. It was, as I say, excellent, and it highlighted just how things have changed, the extent to which our neighbours, our EU neighbours to the east and in the north, are so fearful of what's happening in Europe and for European security. Some of them fear for their very existence as free sovereign states. Europe is rearming. There's no question about that. It's happening quickly. We're maybe a little bit detached from those concerns, given our geographic position, being far from the front line, so to speak. But this is transforming Europe, and it is the topic that everyone is talking about at EU level these days. Just to reflect in terms of how we are behind the curve here in Ireland, I don't think it's a useful measure to compare defence spending as a percentage of GDP for a number of reasons, including Ireland's GDP numbers being inflated a lot by the multinational sector. So let's just look at defence spending as a percentage of total government spending. And Ireland is the only country, now it's probably changed, the numbers are for 2022, it's probably changed a bit since then, but in 2022, Ireland was the only EU country to spend less than 1 in 100 of the euro spent by government on defence. As you can see, the Baltics way up there at 5% of their expenditure going on defence, and that's risen a lot since then. So a big change coming about, but Ireland certainly will, despite being further away, will certainly have to follow that trend. A lot of implications around that. As Europe rearms, the defence industry is going to expand. A lot of focus on that at the session yesterday. That's unfortunately, regrettably, from every perspective, economic included, terrible that money has to be invested in an insurance policy to rearm. But that is the tragic reality we live with, and that is going to happen, and Ireland can be part of it or can exclude itself, but it will be happening regardless of our decision. From an FDI perspective, it also means that issues around cables, much discussed and rightly so, undersea infrastructure could be affected, and this could affect FDI decisions. On a more positive note, from an Irish perspective, it may be that distance from the front line actually makes Ireland a more attractive place for FDI into Europe, particularly from the United States. which is so important. So let's look at the dashboard of economic indicators from Ireland. There are, of course, many. I've selected a few. Let's start with the labour market, which is quite miraculous. It's been good in Europe, but Ireland's been a standout. Employment growth this decade has been second strongest in the EU amongst the 27 after Malta. It's been a success story, one that, in fact, I often wonder how we continue growing employment at the rate we're doing, given that a lot of the employment is down to migration, and given the housing situation, it's hard to know where people are finding places to live when they come here to work. Another way of looking at the number of people employed is breaking it down between those who are on temporary contracts and permanent contracts. Was a media narrative, maybe less spoken of these days than it was maybe 5-7 years ago, about increased precariousness in the labour market. That narrative was data free, as some media narratives can be. As we can see here in Ireland, all the employment growth in Ireland over the past 25 years and more since the data series began has been in permanent contracts, and as a share of people working, the number of people on temporary contracts has plummeted. So nearly every measure of employment growth in Ireland is positive. It's difficult to find a measure that doesn't say positive things, and that includes employment rate, temporary contracts, you name it. It's pretty much uniformly positive. Another element that has been positive and marks Ireland out from other countries to most other countries in Europe is that the migration we've had has been skilled and directly into employment. So if we look in most countries, and in particular for migrants who come from outside the EU, the chances are the percentage of people who work is considerably lower than the share of native citizens. So if we look at this slightly busy chart here, if we look at Ireland in terms of the red symbol is for Irish citizens. The circular blue symbol is for citizens from the rest of the EU, and the box below, slightly below, is for citizens from outside the EU. But as we can see, these are very, very close and quite high for everyone. So if we look at the countries that have had integration problems, maybe countries like Belgium, countries like the Netherlands, countries like Sweden, we see that the immigrants who have come from outside the EU have a much lower employment rate than others. But in Ireland, we've managed that, whether by accident or design, it's been very successful in terms of most people who come here are working, and it's similar to the population already here, both native and from the rest of the EU. Another positive for workers, employees, and for domestic consumer demand in the economy is that wages are on the up, and that is despite inflation coming down. Over the past 4 quarters, we've had over 5% nominal weekly earnings growth. And as I say, that's despite inflation coming back down to 2% over that period. If we go back to 2022, 2023, when inflation peaked, we saw lower nominal wage increases, yet much higher inflation, which means that real wages contracted around this time, whereas now they're strongly in positive territory. People often ask, how does Ireland really compare in terms of economic growth? Certainly, I think nobody would deny the economy is doing well, but how does it actually affect people? Some people often say that they don't feel it. So maybe the best measure for this is to look at disposable income, which is adjusted for population and adjusted for inflation. So we can see the average income growth of individuals and households. So if we look at going back to 2008, we'll see that the Danes among Western Europe have seen, on a per person and adjusted for inflation, have seen the biggest increase in their disposable incomes. The Italians are still below 2008 with effectively a growthless economy. We in Ireland, as it has been sort of the case for a long time, tend to do something of a roller coaster with very deep crashes, people will recall, post-2008, and that led real incomes to fall considerably. But we've then had the most rapid, if we look from 2014 to 2021, real income growth on a percentage basis has been more rapid than Denmark and the highest in the EU. Since then, and largely because of the inflation shock, we've seen a decline in disposable income. I would expect when the 2024 data come out to see that bump up considerably. But if we look at how Irish average real incomes compare to the rest of the EU, we're actually very similar over a 15-year period from 2008 to 2023, albeit with a lot more up and down than the average across the bloc. Another major positive has been the growth in exports. This has been a huge success for the Irish economy, part of as a part of the major element of attracting foreign direct investment. These export-oriented firms are huge exporters. Maybe people aren't as aware, but the amount of exports these days of services, the revenue earned from services exports now far exceeds goods exports. We see now annually last year, goods services exports to the rest of the world came in at about €500 billion. Massive figures. Clearly, the tech companies have a major presence here. They've increased their employment in recent years by a lot. They're running an awful lot of their global profits through Ireland. Hence, they're booking a lot of these as exports out of Ireland. Risks around this, of course, with the transatlantic conflict, economic and trading conflict potentially having an effect on this. Something to watch. In terms of our goods exports, they've doubled over the past 10 years in nominal terms, mostly driven by pharmaceuticals. And as we see here, this very unusual major uptick in the first quarter was driven by pharmaceutical exports to the United States, trying to get ahead of tariffs that were coming in. So that explains this very sharp uptick here, which we could expect to fall back. That spike is very unlikely to last. But the overall picture is the export side of things in the economy, as has been the case for a long time, continues to do very well. Yet another reflection of a strong economy is what's happening with taxes. Let's have a look at income taxes for a start. Longer term picture here, we saw a very sharp increase coming out of the pandemic. Slightly tapering off a bit here, which slightly surprises me given wage and employment growth in recent quarters. But we see that it's still growing in most of the 4 out of the past 5 months of the year so far. We've seen year-on-year increases in income tax receipts. But corporation tax, much talked about, and rightly so, is simply too good to be true. We see how it's gone on a 12-month rolling basis. Very, very unusually for any country. We are now taking in, or the government is taking in, more from corporation tax on a 12-month rolling average basis than it is from income tax. Corporation tax, this does include the Apple judgment, the Apple taxes, back taxes that are being paid. But even without that, there has been yet another huge surge, potential for even more for various reasons. But this is simply totally out of line with other countries. It's about 4 or 5 times higher than the average. Our corporation tax as a share of all our government revenue is about 4 or 5 times higher than most other countries. Not really a good reason to think that's going to last indefinitely. It may last for years to come, but we have certainly become very dependent on that, and we can see that. We know that is a risk for the public finances. The Fiscal Advisory Council report out this week did very good work in separating out, and has been doing very good work at separating out what the public finances might look like, or what the surplus deficit might look like if we didn't have what it's described as excess corporation tax, the windfall element of it. And as they show here, they would expect that if you take out that windfall element of the corporation tax, we're actually still running budget deficits, which is not a slightly worrying place to be. The big increase in revenues has also led to an erosion of fiscal discipline. There's no doubt about that. We're back into pro-cyclical fiscal territory again from the Fiscal Advisory Council's latest report, which came out earlier this week. And for those who listen to the podcast, we're recording at lunchtime on Thursday, the 12th of June. As we can see here, increasing overruns of government spending. And as the council points out, this is spread out beyond health and it's going into other departments. So certainly a concern there. And from a macroeconomic perspective, with interest rates falling, having the fiscal position further stimulating the economy is very far from ideal from just a macro perspective, as well as other perspectives as well. Just to finish on the housing thing, and an issue that I think we've skirted around a bit in this country, I think we do need to highlight it. As I said, the migration piece has been extremely positive for Ireland, in terms of not least the skills and high share of immigrants who work. But we have seen in recent years, post-pandemic, extremely high levels of population growth, way beyond the European average, UK, US, and that's almost entirely these days now brought about by migration. I think there have to be questions about migration. Of course, brings many positives, but there are some downsides. And with housing, in the problems we're having in housing in particular, and the stagnation of housing output over the past 3 years, there has to be some questions about managing the demand side, because certainly the supply side, as we see, has stagnated over the past 3 years. This morning's new house permissions for new dwellings confirmed that the stagnation in the construction sector for new homes. So that doesn't look like it's going to improve anytime soon. And therefore, maintaining very high levels of migration is going to, I think, have to come on the agenda as an issue in relation to housing, and not just the discussion of the supply side. So let me finish on that. I hope that was of use, and wishing you all thank you for coming, and wishing you all a good rest of the afternoon. Thank you.